Hi everyone, this is Saranya, founder of the Bombay Poetry Crawl, and in today's podcast episode, I will be interviewing Vasvi Kejriwal. Vasvi Kejriwal leads Freshment, a project that serves to share and highlight literary works from communities that have been underrepresented in literature. She's a Pushcart Prize nominee and also the recipient of the Al Young Memorial Scholarship from the Community of Writers Conference. And her work is absolutely incredible. In case you've not read it, she's been placed as a finalist for the Yellowwood Poetry Prize and Epiphany 2025 Breakout Prize. She's been commended for the Troubadour Poetry Prize. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Florida Review, Rattle, Nimrod, Poetry Journal, Shō Poetry Journal, and a bunch of other places. Vasvi is a recipient of the Al Young Memorial Scholarship and along with fellowships and funding from the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing and the Watering Hole. Currently, she's an MFA student at NYU and she loves discovering the names of flowers she's crossing paths with for the first time. So, here's our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Okay, hi Vasvi. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Hi, Saranya. It's such a pleasure to be here.
How are you?
Let's do
What's
it.
it like in New York right now?
Um, yeah, it's great. It's definitely, I think if you're talking about weather, we just skipped spring and we're right into summer, right from winter. So it's become warm. But otherwise, New York has got a great literary scene since we're definitely here for the Bombay Poetry Crawl podcast, so bringing it back topic. It's definitely got a lot of parallels with Mumbai in that sense.
Tell us what you're doing in New York.
I am doing the MFA, um, and I've just completed 1 year. And it's been sort of, I guess, like in many ways, I think a lot of people know this, that one does not need an MFA to write, but what the MFA does give you is this community, like
Mm.
just being able to be in a room and mention Sharon Olds or Major Jackson or Aga Shahid Ali in a room, and and then you have other people just nod and understand who you're talking about without the need for further explanation. That's quite invaluable because poetry is kept like this prized sort of art form away from, I guess, a lot of people and just made very inaccessible, sadly, compared to a lot of other art forms and
Yeah.
pop culture that like songs or media or movies or cinema. So in that sense, the MFA is like this great compost heap of ideas. Trying to work on a manuscript right now, that has somehow made its way into stubbornly becoming or dwelling upon the circular nature of grief as an emotion,
Mm.
and how grief just functions as a part of every day, and it's actually a part of the mundane, and it's not this specific emotion that we single out and romanticize about sometimes. So that is what the manuscript is about, but it's still a work in progress. That is what I'm doing in New York right now.
I
Okay.
really appreciate you talking about how poetry is generally looked at as this like faraway thing that happens in books or in like dusty libraries or like these really elusive, exclusive spaces. Um, and I know that a lot of the work that you do with freshmen is about making poetry more accessible. So tell us about Freshment, and I have a lot of questions also about your writing, but I want to know about this. What is Freshment? When did you start it? What do you do with it?
Okay. So Freshman started off as a Substack that failed. It started off basically TMI, but I was going through a complete existential crisis in 2021, and I was in the throes of corporate law, and just sort of feeling like I need a purpose in life outside my job. So that's how Freshman came to be. Before that, actually, it I decided I'm going to call it the last leaf, which somehow just seemed to add to the depression I was going through at the moment. So I said, no, I'm going to actually make this or name it something that I love and I'm obsessed with. And I was like, I'm always obsessed with, it sounds like probably just really basic, but I'm obsessed with tea and mint tea and just the idea of minting something new and fresh. And I didn't really know what it was going to be about then. And that's the emotion behind it. But then I think within weeks of it, I understood what it was going to be about. I was obsessed with the writing process. I was obsessed with bringing writing to people. I was obsessed with this concept of thinking that corporate citizens or people go to office for some reason, this stereotype that they're not creative, or this stereotypical idea that they don't have a creative side to them. And I wanted to basically make poetry and art accessible to people who people would consider non-creative or would not get it or do not understand what it means, which is how what the idea of poetry is, that it's esoteric and it's just, that what we just spoke about. So that is how it came into being, and I didn't know what it would look like. And I was really not capitalist ambitious with it. It was just really something selfish and for myself to give myself a purpose of being. And then I started realizing that I am into the concept of being a teaching artist. I didn't know that's what it's called, but just sort of like meant that bringing the love of the written word to people in different ways.
Mhm.
Um, it could look like a poetry walk. It could look like a workshop. It could look like a generative writing workshop. It could look like sort of, I guess, just reading circles. It could just be anything really. And that hadn't been fleshed out. And then, of course, we have poetry walks. I'll talk about that, or the poet Meena Kumari poetry crawl that we did together. I have to mention that. And then there were, of course, other poets that were covered, like Imtiaz Dharker, Leanord Cohen. Um, a little bit about my experience about maybe curating a route around a city, and maybe you have a similar experience because you've, of course, like done so many and amazing walks. Like something about reliving a poet's verses or anecdotes from their life while retracing their footsteps through a city seem to have taken on a life of excavating a memory. It sounds probably more abstract than it is, but it just to me then a poem sort of seemed to appear as a tail end of something larger, and then something that you just kept tugging and tugging only to give away to a whole uncharted history or neighborhood. And you could have maybe walked that neighborhood a million times in your life before that, but you wouldn't see it in the same way. So the neighborhood just took on this whole new identity after being set against a poem and the context of a lived experience. And then when you think about it, poetry comes from the Greek poesis, which means to make, and artifact is a marriage of act and fact.
Oh.
So just the idea of fact coming from the Latin for something made, and so when you think about that, then I sort of couldn't unsee the fact that every poem was a telling of something, an artifact, a chronicler, a document of recording something larger. Um, and that's how I guess just thinking about poems as artifacts and then gave way to this whole other avenue within Freshman to explore different ways of bringing poetry to people.
So it's not, so Freshman isn't just online on Instagram, you're also out there, like you're in cities, you're in spaces, working with people directly. And I find it so interesting. Sorry, what?
I would disagree.
No, I find it really interesting that you use the word teaching artist to define yourself. So what does that look like? I want to know more about the walks, the workshops, the other events that you do.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's thank you for asking that question. It's definitely an identity that still feels new to me, and it's something that I think of myself as a poet in progress and a teaching artist in progress. Definitely like someone who's still learning and building my toolkit and nowhere near there. I guess what that looks like is, in a way, um, the idea of sort of just poetry being, what does blue symbolize? Does it, in this poem, does it symbolize grief or sadness or the royalty or like I just kind of got tired of that narrative.
Yeah.
of poems sort of being broken down and deconstructed into metaphors and similes and figurative devices, as if that's all they were. Because
Yeah.
then you could just have a poem that's a list of just literary devices, and that's what a poem is, but that's not the soul of the poem. And so I guess it was more sort of I guess the idea of alt pedagogy, that would be the term, or just sort of being a little more hands-on and rough around the edges about the way we approach poetry was appealing to me. Um, because I think whenever I've approached a poem without any expectations and without any pressure is when I've gotten the most out of it. And when it's sort of like maybe left a mark on me in a way that I want to keep revisiting it. So that is just the experience of what I want to bring to people. Um, the idea of a city or being in cities, for instance, in New York, recently Rashman did an event on Meena Alexander, and that was, something that really drew me in because Meena Alexander, for instance, she has two couplets in her poem Night Theater, and I'll say them out loud. She says, "We have no words for what is happening, still language endures," Celan said. And it's a poem that maybe won't be talking about what is happening. It's not being direct about it, but it's also being direct about it. And it's so relevant today with everything that is happening around us right now, which is quite unbelievable. So definitely, those words drew me in, and I wanted to read more of her work. And then I realized that she was of course, this Indian writer who had migrated between India and Sudan and then moved to the US. And then her experiences were all about chronicling a time in New York. And that is what really drew me in. She was a city poet in so many ways. She wrote about the environment after the 9/11 attacks, for instance, and the way she writes about it is by talking about her fear of wearing a sari in public because of the social stigma and how everyone was otherizing and marginalizing other cultures at that time. And it's the metaphor of the sari crumpled in her handbag like a little ball that is sort of like that is explaining her discomfort and just her, I guess, like her
Yeah.
fear of being out in public. It's all taken out in that sari. And then we also have Mirabai meeting Allen Ginsberg in Central Park in one of her poems,
Oh,
which can
wow.
only happen in Meena Alexander poem because she was obsessed with Krishna and Mirabai and the Bhakti movement and the Bhakti poets. And she'd also been studying Allen Ginsberg's journals while he was in Rajasthan, right
Oh,
before,
wow.
like this was after he passed away. And so just having them meet in an area like Central Park, like for me, that was genius in so many ways. And then you just see the city differently. So for me, it was just a no-brainer that I had to do this walk with Meena Alexander. And more than, I guess, teaching people, I'm learning. Like
Yeah.
I'm learning so much about the city and the people and the poems and the poet, artist.
What I love about your walks, the ones that I've attended in Bombay, I haven't had the chance to come for the New York one yet, but it's always been the most surprising writers that I read, and that's what I want to ask you about. Like, why have you chosen so far Meena Kumari, Leonard Cohen, Imtiaz Dharker, and why these poets in these places in this city?
That is like, I guess, a great question, but I'll honestly say there's no blueprint I follow. When it comes to selecting which artists I choose to focus upon. It sounds like the most cliche, run-of-the-mill answer in the book, but I follow my intuition and feeling. I guess I have the privilege to sort of not make freshmen my primary source of monetary income,
Yeah.
and that allows me to sort of go with intuition and feeling. And then because of that, I'm able to look at like what I spoke about earlier about, just sort of like pairing anecdotes with the places in the city. And this is also reminding me of this quote I read in the New York Times by Catherine Halley. She was, I think, a former director of the Poetry Foundation in Chicago, where she says that when you're looking at the place that the poem was written or where the poet lived, then the poem, it enters your body. Um, yeah, the poem, it enters your body. It sounds like very abstract again, but I think that is really the feeling I went with. So if
Yeah.
I came across something that I guess just gave the poem like this other dimension or the place another dimension, then I just wanted to know more. And that's how it started. With Meena Kumari, of course, it was just the fact that I lived in Bandra.
Yeah.
And that was quite, it just sort of like makes you see the neighborhood in a different light, and you just sort of don't pass by the same landmarks. And I guess, yeah, we did it together. So that's why it was really special. And then in Leonard Cohen, because he's obviously known as a quintessential, like, white singer-songwriter, broody. Like he's compared to Bob Dylan. He's
Yeah.
captured the fancies of so many.
Yeah.
But no one knows he was obsessed with Bombay. Whenever I tell people that he was obsessed with Bombay and he's written book of poetry on Bombay, it just always like raised a lot of alarm from people. And then it just I guess the walk was also the space of just debating. Like interestingly, his poems opened up this entire debate on a white man's perspective in India versus what how India is looked at by the
Mm,
West,
yeah.
whether we see it that way. And so it was just an interesting, I guess, interesting experience for many people who would obsess over him and to
Yeah.
see India through his eyes.
Yeah.
And the other, I guess the other, I mean, Imtiaz Dharker just needs no introduction. I think she's just fabulous. For me, she's a complete rock star. Whenever I think about or tell people that she turned down the poet laureateship in 2019, that's just so fantastic because she'd written so many beautiful books, and a lot of her work chronicles a nostalgia of Bombay's past and the gustatory culture in Mumbai, like the food and the migration of food.
Yeah. So if Bombay is has played such a vital role um in your teaching artistry, does the city show up in your writing? Does it influence your own writing? I know that you've lived in Calcutta, Bombay, Bangalore, London, New York. So I'm interested in how these cities, I'm probably not even naming all of them, I don't know, but like I'm interested in how these spaces enter your writing, your own writing.
I think cities play a part in my writing. And definitely when I've left them, then I feel closer to them. It's just the sad state of the human affair.
Yeah.
When you don't have something,
Yeah.
you reminisce about it.
Yeah.
So I'll just sort of tie that in there. Um, and I would say I've spent a lot of I mean, I spend, my hometown is Kolkata. I lived there for the first 20 years of my life. So definitely Kolkata shows up in my work in many, many ways. Mumbai did give me something special in the sense that I felt like I could be a woman walking on the street at night. I hadn't felt that in any other city till then in India. And so Mumbai definitely appears, for instance, in one of my poems. I think you had mentioned about walking towards Dr. Sidhu. So again, like in that poem, I'm walking, and that was really subconscious. But I think the idea of just being able to walk was so new for
Yeah.
me that it entered a poem that I was walking in Bandra, and it's there in that poem that I was walking because it was just it was just, yeah, literally a new phenomena for me because I think in a lot of other cities, at least in North India, it's definitely not as accessible streets
Yeah.
for women. Uh, and uh, and Mumbai has also shown up in, I guess there is one poem I've written about the Paris bakery in Dhobi Talao that also has been really close to my heart, and in the sense that I've always felt the city has held so much, has been a container for so many different cultures, people, and of course you have the water everywhere. And the sea everywhere that's just there. But I think I've still not exhausted my Bombay stimulus. I'm up in more of my poems.
What about London and New York and Bangalore, which are interestingly three places where you also were studying and living, right? In these three.
Yes, okay, yes. In London, I have had a bunch of poems that have just been very set within corporate environments. Like all the poems that take place inside offices,
I
and
want to
that's
read
because I
those.
did a lot of my life in offices in London. I felt like I was not really living in London, but living inside the office. So, so yeah, there have been poems in London, but I guess I was just yeah, they're very sort of like a commentary on the corporate psyche and the corporate hierarchy, those poems. But at the other side, I guess New York is very similar to Bombay. I think the humidity, I do love humidity. The humidity is great. There's water, like from like almost like if you walk a little bit, you'll see water. There's a lot of jaywalking, just a lot of it. There is, it's common to see, for instance, dumpsters in parks that are like overflowing. So those are parts of New York that really do remind me
It's
of
like home.
Bombay. Yeah, it definitely feels like home. That
Yeah,
is exactly what I'm trying to say.
yeah.
So in a way, I have had poems that I've written. I've only been here for like 6 months. I have found myself writing about New York in a similar vein to Bombay, and more in the sense of the people I'm meeting. And they enter my poems in interesting ways.
Another time that you wrote about Bombay, not in poetry but in prose, was when you wrote about the Meena Kumari walk experience. And I absolutely love that essay because it doesn't read like a historical, like this non-fiction boring piece about like place and time. It reads like a really fun, creative piece that brings alive a poet and a city that I didn't even know of until I read it. So apart from the walk and listening to her songs and watching her movies and writing about her, what is it about Meena Kumari that draws you to her?
Hmm. Well, there's so much about the the mystery of her that has drawn me to her or drew me to her. Also, the idea of her living this alt existence within her notebook that people didn't know about, and it was under a pen name called Naz, and then she was a beautiful singer as well, and she would sing her what she would write, and also just the idea of how I think her identity sort of had been really commodified and still is in India. Sort of like the Marilyn Monroe of India, the tragedy queen of India. She is always sort of crying over her lovers on the screen or dying over them or always reaching a tragic death. So there's that idea of the tragic confessional female being
Yeah,
romanticized. I think we've spoken about this before, even during our walk, we talk
yeah.
about it. So that definitely, that stereotype, it's sort of like how every teenage girl has that rite of passage of reading Sylvia Plath, even though later she might find problems with Sylvia Plath's words. So sort of like that, maybe it was like a rite of passage for me where I needed to excavate more, like understand more about what was going on. And then I think there was this, maybe it could maybe call it like maybe it is a kind of obstinacy, but I really wanted to see another side to it. I was adamant to read these poems that everyone was saying were tragic. Even after reading them, it was like, oh, but this is the voice of someone who's depressed. This is the voice of someone who is dying. This is the voice of someone who doesn't. So just sort of like there was this obstinacy of reading those poems to find more.
Another freshman experience that I had that was uh really different and so enjoyable was when you took the food poetry workshop and we were in Cafe de la Paix eating bun maska with chai and reading and writing poems. I have read some of your poems. I've had the privilege of reading some poems that you've curated around food, and I've also attended this food workshop. So, what is food in poetry for you? Like, why is it such a recurring character?
Um, Food has appeared in poetry since the beginning of poetry itself. Sort of mention some idea of consumption for survival. or consumption for either it was a sign of luxury and elitism, where it was you're drinking a very fine wine, and if that was written in a poem, that means that this is written by someone who's from a privileged class, or like a dynasty, or from a royal sect of society. But if they were maybe eating like something like bread or something more common, it reveals so much about status, about wealth, about society. So again, going back to the idea of a poem being an artifact.
Yeah.
I think food itself or the consumption of food is an artifact, and because a poem is such a spare space, and the what sets a poem apart from fiction or non-fiction or a broader piece of literature is that it's tinier or it's more
Yeah.
compact. And when you mention food in there, it's very revealing. So that is why I think because food itself is so revealing when we think of food in poetry, there are so many dimensions to uncover. So even the workshops that I mention or I talk about food, we look at socio-political commentary like Ode to Tomatoes with Pablo Neruda, where we're talking about like the war and violence. There's also I Hate Raisins by Natalie Diaz. You also have the Idlis in Arun Koletkar's poems, of course. Um, there's just so many ways of looking at food that fascinates me, and I think it's just this never-ending project of like uncovering more and more poems that detail a food and a culture. I also think that when you're, I guess, trying to bring poetry to people who believe or have been taught to believe that they will not understand poetry,
Mm.
or that they are not, made for poetry, or that poetry is not for them, or
Yeah.
that, they cannot write poetry. For some reason, food and memory are two pathways that I find are very accessible and don't seem as daunting. But at the same time, they open out, they're like portals when you're trying to write into a space that only you can write about. Um, and also, just talking about food, it's definitely a way to archive your own culture because everyone has a very specific dish they make at home that's prepared in a certain way. The family has made it. And without sort of realizing you're revealing so much about your heritage and your culture and the way your culture has interacted with the world. Um, and you're just sort of tired to see, I guess, like creme brulee and apple pie and Thanksgiving roast in poems that are considered to be, I guess, like good or taught. You just, so like I was sort of like, let's see rasmalai and jalebi, and
Yeah.
let's sort of see, these beautiful other dishes that haven't sort of like appeared or haven't been made the norm. You even see Indian poets, young poets writing today, and they need to, or they feel the need to anglicize
Mm.
so much of what they're trying to say and make it sound like sometimes like you see, or I recently saw someone wanting to talk about the jalebi, but they wrote about it like a funnel cake because it's more palatable for American audiences. But just the idea of, I
Palatable,
guess,
pun intended.
palatable, palatable.
Sorry,
That's a good
yes.
one. That's a good one. Yeah, so basically, so I think that is what has drawn me to food, and even the poem that I wrote that is based in the Paris bakery in Dhobi Talao. It was sort of an exercise to do that, and like an ode to the person or the magician, as people call him,
Yeah.
uh, at the Paris bakery, selling this like mawa cake for so many years. So yeah, there's so many ways that poems immortalize a culture via food.
And with your own work, the poem that I know that has gotten you a lot of favorable popularity is the one that got published in the Bombay Lit magazine a couple of years ago. There's no title to it, it's just called Poem 2, but um it's in the shape, it's an oval shape, which at first I thought was an egg, but then it starts with a jalapeno. And that is a food poem. In my opinion, it could be a food poem. But I want to know about your experience writing it and the intention behind choosing a particular shape for that particular poem.
Wow, it's been so long since I wrote
It's
that poem.
a good poem.
Um, Thank you. Okay. I'm learning to receive compliments.
That's all you have
Um,
to say. Just say thank you. That's it.
okay. So I will actually quote, I don't want to quote, but I'll refer to an essay I read on Poetry Foundation about the shapes because that's something that I really try to think so much about why am I containing it in a shape? And do we really need to put this in a shape? Like, for instance, that was a question that I asked myself a zillion
Ah.
times when I was writing that. And I think one of the reasons why I did, I'll first give my reason and then I'll talk about this essay that I came across that drew me to shape poetry for this particular piece. Um, in that poem, there are so many perspectives and timelines
Mm.
and shifting. The persona shifts between a woman, a older woman, and a woman who's younger than the woman. So there's like a past, present, future. There is geographical positioning being changed. There's a lot of chaos.
Mm.
So it did feel like a risk when I was trying to add all of that into one poem, especially because in the workshop we are taught that don't move around too much, stick to clarity, and things like that. That's like the rules of craft or,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So the idea of containing it in a shape or the idea of containing all of that in one big egg seemed like the only way to do it. Because when I actually had it as a prose block or as a couplet form, I tried various recurring motif of the egg that keeps coming up. And so the idea of the egg sort of being this expression or a gift of receiving and
Mm.
care shows up in that poem. And I wanted that to sort of be the central. There is this essay in the Poetry Foundation by Tishani Doshi, actually, and because she's really big into concrete poems, and there's this entire debate of whether concrete poetry is gimmicky and tacky,
Mm.
and do we really need it? And there's a lot of mixed opinions on this all over the world, even by major publishers. And she speaks of hearing Vikram Chandra talk about Chitra Kavya, which is the poetry of amazement.
Yeah.
And he introduces us to Anandavardhana, one of the literary greats, but he also calls him like slightly pretentious because he's a ninth century Sanskrit poet who has an idea what is bad poetry and good poetry. And in bad poetry, he has a whole list of things that you do not do this, you do not do that, you do
I
not do
think I
this.
have that same list. But yeah.
Right. Yes, and one of the things on that is you do not write or use the trick of a shape to achieve an effect. And that is, one of the lectures he says, and he says the top of the list is just no to Chitrakavya or picture poetry. And then at the same time, he ends up writing The Goddess's Century, which is one of the greatest Chitrakavyas of all time. It makes no sense. The same person writing it, and it's 100 shloka sutra in loving worship of the goddess. And the final 20 shlokas are in the shape of a wheel, and Ananda Vardhana reveals his identity in the inner rim of the wheel, um, and telling sort of revealing that he was instructed to write this poem by the goddess who came to him in his dream. And so Vikram Chandra tells us that by making this image for the goddess, it allows us to look upon the form of the goddess. And so it reveals the form of the goddess through language. And I guess the idea of the reader sort of staying with the form and the shape as like the lasting image of the poem stayed with me. And then I also thought about this idea of how language is never just about what is being said, but it's also about how it is held. And
Yeah.
that is why we have so many forms, and how the form can sort of become an extension of the content itself, because it's amplifying or adding a whole other dimension to what is being said.
And so then if that is one way that you you felt that the poem made sense later, because you said that you played with a lot of forms. In the other poem of yours, Walking Towards Dr. Sidhu, um, it's inspired by a Chen poem. So I'm interested, like, what what started that? Was it that you wanted to write um an inspired poem after another poet, or how did you choose that particular form? And also, I really appreciate how the poem goes to so many places, and it's a very traveling poem, and it feels like it goes everywhere, but also we are in this one confined space of this of walking towards this doctor. So what was writing that poem like?
I think that's exactly what I mean, along the same vein as what I'm going to say, because that poem travels so much and goes back and forth in time, in place,
In
it
cultures.
goes,
Yeah,
yes, yes, exactly. It refers to songs. There's obviously Bridgerton in there,
yeah,
because it's part of our pop culture reference now.
yes. And he's hot,
Uh,
so he should be in there.
yeah, definitely. Because this poem is also about, I guess, like there is that reference to modern dating and its perils, and there's also that reference to genealogy, what it is like being a woman, I guess, in India where the air quality is so bad, it definitely messes with your hormones, doesn't it?
Yeah,
So there's definitely all of that in there. That is why I talk about, I end on that image of hormonal imbalance, because I think that's, but I'm talking about the Chen structure. I do think that mimesis and imitation is very underrated in almost all art forms, even if you're learning how to do oil painting or if you're learning how to, I guess, just play a song. People start with doing a cover of a song or
yeah,
they will imitate a great. But for some reason, with poetry, it's sort of no, whatever I write in my diary is already great. Let's just like put it out there. So, so just this idea of, I guess, trying to work through a poem that you love and see how it reached where it reached using its form is so underrated. And it's also, I think, one of the biggest tributes you could give to that poet who's written that poem. Like by
absolutely.
working and thinking through each of their lines so closely. And so that poem really spoke to me because it's by Chen's poem called Self-Portrait With and Without. And he basically uses the with and without structure as this loose bone structure. It's made of a skeleton of with and withouts that join these otherwise extremely disjunct images together. And they do it so well and effortlessly. And that does so much of the work in propelling the images forward.
Yeah,
And so I would say that this structure helped me move across all those geographies and time spaces and timelines and emotions and people, because I had not set out to do that when I was writing the poem. But it just sort of allowed, or it was a forgiving structure. It allowed for all of that to enter the poem, and hold space for it, like the bones of the conjunctions. Um, and then the idea of, I guess, ending on the image of hormonal imbalance then also seemed apt because it just sort of seemed so, I guess, like it's almost like you're going through all of that, but it's futile because this is where you are right now. And this is what you've got to deal with. And that is what so much of how so much of life is.
yeah. Yeah, I find that when I write, I find that there are a couple of things that I'm constantly obsessed with for years, and this is seen as through the years as my writing changes. And we're talking about how you play with form. With me, it's sometimes I think that I've been obsessed with interrogating rhythm in poetry. When it started, like in like creative writing classes, it was like iambic meter, like the easy stuff, and then I just started to really get
Yeah.
interested in like how is rhythm written and read and sung
Mhm.
and all of that. And I think that's something that
Mhm.
I'm constantly thinking about when I write. So what is something that you are interrogating or that you're currently interrogating through your writing?
I am currently very interested in trying to go to the outskirts of myself at the moment and my writing, just in terms of trying things that I've never tried before.
Hmm.
Because otherwise, I think it's very possible to get into a writer's burnout. I don't think there's anything called writer's block. I really think it's writer's burnout. Because I think
You
we
are so
all
right.
have so much going on within us at
Yeah,
all times that there's always so much to write about.
yeah,
Because, yeah, writers are just slightly self-absorbed, slightly. So to be able to talk about their own emotions all the time. So I do feel that it's the burnout of how to talk about it in a fresh way that's exciting and people would actually want to read it because it's not my diary. So at the moment, I'm trying to break that by, I guess, exploring new forms. It could be the erasure, it could be the pantoum, it could be the golden shovel. I'm still a far way off it because that doesn't come naturally to me, but I'm very interested in exploring that and making that a part of my like part of my everyday practice if I can.
Yeah, that's great. And just like to backtrack a little bit to a few years ago when you were in not London, but you were in these glass offices and you were living there and breathing there. I really want to know about what your relationship is like to the language of law and the language of poetry. And I'll tell you, I interviewed another Bombay-based poet. His name is Zubair Azmi. He's an advocate in the High Court and he's also a poet himself and he runs an Urdu library and all of that. And I asked him this question because when I was studying poetry in the MFA, I was really interested. In fact, I wanted my thesis to be about like questioning the language of the law through poetry and stuff because I find that they are both seen as such like esoteric, inaccessible uh, vocabularies.
Mm.
But Zubair Azmi ji, he actually told me that he finds them to be very similar and he finds that his poetry helps his law writing and his law writing helps his poetry. That's of course just his experience, but I'm curious, I'm so curious about yours because poetry seems like it should be so natural, whereas law seems like it should be so, like strict and technical.
Mm. Okay, that's like, thank you for that. So that's so much to unpack there. For instance, I have to mention, I mean, because we're talking about the intersection of law and poetry, I have to mention Monica Yun. And she's a former lawyer, very senior lawyer turned poet. And all her poems really talk about the intersection of law, the written word, and poems in this like gorgeous way. She has a book called Blackacre I would recommend that just talks about property law, for instance,
Oh
and how it
wow.
intersects with how the side effects of how property law has affected so many. And she also has From that talks about marginalization and cultures, again speaking through the language of the law where possible, not so much as Blackacre, but still it does. I would definitely say that there are poets out there who have done it miraculously or found that sweet spot where both spaces intersect. And I'm still figuring out what that means for me. I would say that definitely there has been an impact of the law in the way I write, because of just like the way it's been making me think. So, for instance, I have been dwelling a lot upon this idea of force majeure at the moment, and the idea of an act of God and how it's defined in contracts. And
Hmm.
a couple of poems in the manuscript I'm working towards revolve around this idea of force majeure and how and what force majeure means outside the contract, this act of God, this unprecedented natural event. Can it take place in ways that is not a natural hazard? How does it take place in your own life? What is a force majeure for you? And um, how does that interact with the way you see the world? And what is an act of God? Just the idea of God. Who is God? Who is a legal God? How does God act? What are God's actions? And just the way the legal terminology is phrased. I think the other idea about law that has made me look at the words differently is that I guess it really makes you think of words as tools.
Hmm.
Sometimes when we write poems, we don't understand the power of each single word
Yeah.
that we're dealing with and the weight of it. But when you're writing or drafting a contract,
Yeah.
every word is so important. So
Yeah.
you're sort of learn to like you put weight on each word. Um, I think what has made me think about poems differently is that the law definitely made me go deeper into the etymology of each word. So,
Hmm.
for instance, hearse and rehearse are two things that root from the same Latin origin or the Old English origin,
Oh shit, that's cool.
H-E-R-C-E. Yeah, and there's so many words that have come so far because of the way we've used them in cultures or the way they've traveled across continents that they now mean very different things, but they
Yeah.
come from the same root. And that is something that is very interesting, at least when thinking of poetry and thinking about if you're thinking about a poem as a commentary on something, then I think the etymology becomes very interesting, and just the idea of how a hearse is a carrier of a body. to its deathbed or to its grave or to, to the pyre, and the idea of how rehearse is an act of performing on stage.
Yeah,
And how so much of this funeral or funerary ceremony or ceremonious rituals are performative in so many senses,
yeah.
and have really nothing to do with the death itself. So the idea of how those two converge is just impossible to sort of not think about it in that way when you don't look at the etymology of the word. And I think that is something that my legal background has prompted me to do, because that's just something that, at least in legal philosophy or in public law and administrative law, is something that it's very common to sort of go into the roots of words. And I'm actually going to cite another favorite poet because we're talking about law and poetry. There's this book by Robert Wood Lynn called Mothman Apologia. And he is a lawyer who's a poet. And for instance, there's a poem in there that's an elegy to fire. There's a series of poems that are elegies to fires. And because in insurance law, you learn that in ancient Rome, when a house was on fire, the way it worked was that it was sort of a corrupt practice, but this part, I think there was a man of prestige or a nobleman, I'm forgetting his name. He would appear and he would sort of agree to buy your house right then and there, as soon as the house was on fire. That is how you would get some money or whatever, insurance. This is ancient Rome we're talking about. And then each second that you thought to think about saying yes to sell your house or not, because you're like, oh, maybe the fire will go down, with each second, the price dropped. With
Oh,
each second, the price dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. And so the each second you stood wondering, you would get less money for your house that was burning. And that is how, I guess, like the birth of the bones of insurance law came into being,
that's
and
interesting.
arson. And he mentions that in a poem, for instance, in his first ever elegy to fire. And the way he weaves it into a poem is quite something. And if anyone can get a hand on that book or is interested in exploring how law intersects with poetry, I definitely recommend that book.
Yeah. That's really fascinating that you said that law actually taught you or encouraged you more to look at etymology of words, because that is what dealing with literature is and dealing with writing is, that we can't look at words in isolation. They come from, like, they have their own history. I find that really fascinating. But then talking again, so now coming back to your current writing, and this is one of my last questions, but apart from being published in Rattle and Swim and Nimrod, and right now you're doing amazing work and you're going to California for a workshop. Is that correct?
I'm going to Community of Writers Conference for the summer poetry program in Nevada.
Nevada, sorry. Yeah, but you're doing all of these really cool things, and to get international recognition and to go and attend these residencies, to get accepted into these MFA programs. There are a lot of young writers and a lot of people asking this question a lot, which is how to put ourselves out there. How do you put yourself out there as a writer?
I guess it's about understanding why you write. What makes you write? Is it for the recognition? Then I would say please don't write.
Yeah.
Because it's just something that, like I mentioned, the writer's burnout, or just like, I guess, how freshman is not my monetary source of income, and how writing is really not realistically that. I think what I'd say to young writers is first figuring out, because I myself consider myself one of them.
Yeah.
But I think what I would say is, first figure out why you want to write. Is it because it's something that, when you have that, your motivations and your intentions clear, then things become clearer. It also, then you understand how ambitious you want to be with your writing and where you want it to go and what vision you have for it. I am currently in, I'm only bringing this up because it's so fresh in my head, but Ocean Vuong often like speaks about this every workshop. Actually, he begins a workshop like this, and maybe it's something that young writers would be interested in hearing by Ocean Vuong via me. That he basically says that competition, prizes, and awards are a part of like a capitalist construct, and it sort of takes your eyes away from the prize. But of course, being realistic. we all want to get published, at least if you're writing for really long, you want your work to get out there, and yeah, that's fair. So if you must use that construct about, this construct of getting forward in your writing, he likens it to public transport, and he talks about getting on a bus. And you're on a bus with a lot of people and all these fellow people who are as ambitious as you and are wanting to get published and get their books out and get to places. So you get on at a stop, you get off at a stop, you write, you get published, you get back on, and you find your people who are in that journey with you, going around probably that similar radius or that similar bus route. It can appear circular at times. You can just feel you're going in the same road again and again. But I think what he's saying is that it's very easy to then start living on the bus and to start forgetting, like that you're trapped on it, and start
Mhm.
forgetting that, oh, there is a point where you get off and go home and
Yeah,
then get back on. And
yeah,
sometimes you just start living there because that's you're from one prize to the other, from one award
yeah,
to the other. I think it's really helpful to think of it that way because it's important to keep writing, but at the same time, it's important to like stop comparing.
yeah.
And I think that's helped me. I was able to take some of the biggest risks in my writing when I was not trying to make my poem sound a certain way,
Hmm.
or to make it sound like, oh, this sounds like it would win an award, or this sounds
Right.
like it would, be received well. I think that's the trap. Um, and of course, the other thing I would say is that being rejected is a part of being a writer. So just, sort of like it sounds easier said than done, but I've told myself this so many times. I've been like, I've got so many peer rejections, no, regular rejections, so many letters by now that I can't count how many. So all I'll say is that just keep piling them on and celebrate those as well. That just means that you have the strength to send your work out.
And you're also on the other side of it now because you're a reader slash editor at TBLM. So, what makes you choose a poem?
Definitely not me who's choosing the poem. Is I think the part of the editorial process that holds it accountable is that it's a group of editors, and
Right.
everyone's opinions matter. And there's like everyone reads them and decides whether it's suitable. Definitely, I would say that because each person reads a very different kind of poetry, or you might have a reader of your poetry in one person and not in another person. It's very important to remember that. Someone who's into lyrical images poetry will not maybe understand a completely narrative, chunky prose poem.
Yeah.
So it just sort of like really depends on who your reader is.
Yeah.
Um, I think the way we choose poems at TBLM is definitely through a lot of discussion. There are 5 rounds,
Oh,
four
wow.
to five rounds, and there are various people reading it, not the same people. And then at the end, there's sort of a full-fledged discussion where the decision is thrashed out. And you sort of have to defend why you like a poem or why you don't like a poem. So it's definitely, there's a lot of accountability in place. Definitely, what I think I would go back to is taking risks in your work, uh, and not thinking about how well it would be perceived or how it should sound like. I think that's often a trap. Sometimes you read work in a journal that's been published and maybe that's not the way you write, but then you're trying to sound like that.
Yeah.
I think it's important to read, not don't get me wrong, very important to read what's being published if and being up to date with that. Keep reading to see what doesn't work for you and what works. It's very important to know. But then keep that aside when you sit down to write. Don't let that come in and take over your voice,
Yeah.
because you're trying so hard to be someone you're not. That's all I have
Really
to
good
say.
advice. And so then it brings me to my last question, which is, what are you writing right now?
Um, I'm I'm dwelling like I'm pulling together a manuscript. I'm not sure whether it's going to be a chapbook or a book yet, but it has been dwelling a lot, as I mentioned, upon grief and the everyday of grief and the unromanticization of grief, and also to speak in legal terms, the force majeure of grief,
Mm.
and how it enters the everyday and how maybe an act of God or force majeure is not such a separated event or isolated event, that we think it is. And so that is what I'm working on. That's a manuscript I'm working on. I'm definitely also excited to be teaching NYU undergraduates in the upcoming fall semester in
Amazing.
Introduction to Prose and Poetry. And then, of course, also very interested or excited to host the writing workshop with you at the Emily Dickinson Museum on food, since
I
we spoke
know.
so much about food. It's online, so if anyone hears this, it could like you can log on from anywhere. And it's yeah, I think there's a limit for at least 200 people to join, so you can definitely join in from wherever you are in the world. Yeah, the dates and all of that will be announced soon in
Okay.
due course.
All very exciting. Thank you, Vasvi. And now that we're finishing, I just have one last request. Can you read a poem of yours?
The Magician, Paris Bakery, Dhobi Talao. He stands behind the counter, beaming, pulls out wads of sponge, mava, mud, fruit, more mava. I flip butter in buckets, he says, maska in boatloads, bags bursting with grease. The real deal, the asli ghee. True love can't be fat-free, sugarless. True love is palm-sized towers of biscuit, batasa, khari, jam-poured naan khatai, flakes and flakes of paste rubbed with pure amul. Gossamer thin, brittle, light shines through when he holds a tower against the sun. His name is Danish, not like the pastry, with a matra, Danish. He casts out edible slivers of pyridiza from within 90 square meters of enclosed space. I watch him turn to face an older version of himself beaming through an oval frame. The man in the photo has silvered hairs springing straight as breadsticks, the sheen in his eyes unlost behind glass, a glimmer from a star long gone reflected on earth. My old man right here was the cow. He rolls the O on his tongue like it is chewy dough. Desi cow, the asli ghee. He babied all this in the 50s. Milkmaid and yolk, maska and shakkar, fills the gap across both generations with the ease of batter filling a mold. A block of sponge appears, a blade is dreamt up, run through the domed bump. He mills a slab of baked flour beneath his fingers, firm like horse legs trampling on mud. It breaks to a mizzle of crumbs beneath the clouds of his palms. Pound of gold butter dust, powdered on his volar, on my tongue. I am eating out of his hand, his face calm as an almond flake, bright like he swallowed a bulb. Need a bag? He asks. I find I bought the cake. I shake my head. No, a force under his tongue. You mustn't hold a cake naked like that and walk. It'll catch nazar.